Hi, my name is Ellis, and this is my project on reserve mining and their pollution in northern Minnesota. Lake Superior is located in between Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ontario. It's the world's largest lake by surface area and fourth deepest in the United States. The lake provides 10% of all the Earth's fresh water, or 3 quadrillion gallons, enough to fill all of North and South America in a foot of water. There are roughly 78 different species of fish that call the lake home, and the Great Lakes in their entirety provide drinking water to 48 million people. Almost 30% of the Canadian population lives off these great freshwater lakes. It's to no one's surprise the level of importance that these lakes have, especially Lake Superior. I think it's important at this time to pause and reflect on the land which this project is focused on. For approximately 14,000 years, Native people have lived on the land that is now Minnesota until it was stolen in the 1700s. Primarily inhabited by the Ojibwe and Dakota tribes, who were the 5th largest native population on the continent and 2nd largest in Canada. We recognize that this land is stolen, their stewardship, their forced removal, and their continued fight to live on their ancestral lands. In addition, Lake Superior provides numerous outdoor recreation opportunities, from sea kayaking to fishing, rock climbing, scuba, boating, and ice skating. Economically, the recreation industry brings in $3.9 billion annually, and nearly 3.5 million people visit Minnesota's shoreline each year. Duluth Superior Port on the eastern tip of Lake Superior, and the ore it ships drives the economy in northern Minnesota. Roughly 20 million tons of iron ore and 1 million tons of grain shipped through annually. The port is the 19th largest in the U.S. by tonnage, despite the harbor being 2,342 miles from the Atlantic Ocean. While shipping itself has some serious environmental consequences to Lake Superior, it's nothing compared to what they're shipping. The second big contributor to Minnesota's economy as a whole is mining. The Lake Superior deposits of iron ore are the largest ever discovered in the United States and provide the bulk of iron ore in the United States, roughly 85% of U.S. demand. Mining in the region accounts for 30% of the GDP. Northern Minnesota currently has 7 open-pit mines and 2 tailings reclamation operations up and running. Iron mining helped contribute more than $3 billion to the state's economy in 2010 and helped support more than 11,200 jobs in Minnesota alone. A 2015 Homeland Security study found that Minnesota's iron mines and America's steelmaking facilities together support 11 million jobs nationwide and account for 16% of GDP. It's an enormous business, one that is unbelievably dirty. Low-grade iron ore generally mined in northern Minnesota is called taconite. It is most commonly found in pellet form, suitable for blast furnaces. A century ago, when high-grade natural iron ore was plentiful, taconite was actually considered a waste rock and not used. In the early 1900s, a group of University of Minnesota engineers and mining industry entrepreneurs allied to develop a technological process to extract iron from the hard ore known as taconite. Formed into iron-rich pellets, this product would then feed the Great Lakes' ever-ravenous steel furnaces. The use of taconite by the steel industry was hastened by World War II, and taconite mining saved Minnesota's iron ore industry in the nick of time. Taconite mining, not surprisingly, is a dirty industry. After being blasted to bits with explosives, the rock is crushed into very small marble-sized pieces, after which the iron is mixed with water and separated out using magnetism. The remaining rock is waste material. The wet concentrate is rolled with clay into small balls, dried, and made into taconite pellets. For every ton of iron ore produced, 2 tons of waste material is left over. After the overmining of high-grade iron and the preceding discovery of taconite mining, new mining companies began business in Minnesota once again. Reserve Mining Company was the first taconite processing facility in North America when it opened in 1952. 3 years later, in 1955, the Reserve Mining Company began operation in Silver Bay, Minnesota. The processing plant for Reserve's taconite mine was situated right off the shore of Lake Superior, but in the 25 years that the company was operating, the distance between the processing plant and water's edge slowly grew. A vast delta had been created by the accumulation of the fine waste rock that Reserve was discharging into Lake Superior. Their processing plant crushed taconite rocks to allow for the extraction of iron they contained, but 2/3 of the taconite was discharged in the form of tailings. By 1960, business was booming, and the company expanded its production from 6 million to 10 million tons of taconite per year. By 1980, the delta had grown to such a degree that the processing plant was over 1/3 of a mile from the edge of Lake Superior. This waste is called tailings. More specifically, it is the waste rock or material that lies on top of the ore and is displaced during mining without being processed. The waste material was initially considered no more harmful than sand, and the dumping was approved by the Minnesota State Legislature. But by the late 1960s, local environmental groups, commercial fishermen, and sport fishing groups began to complain about the taconite sediment. The U.S. began regulating asbestos in the 1960s and 70s. It was found that not only were the tailings bad for the water, but in addition they included something called cummingtonite grunerite, a substance found in asbestos and a known carcinogen. Word spread quickly, and it was soon found that reserve mining was dumping nearly 47 tons of this waste rock into Lake Superior every minute, roughly 67,000 tons a day. As fishermen, local environmental groups, homeowners, and visitors continued to complain about the taconite sediment, many arguing it was killing fish and clouding the waters, mineral fibers similar to those in reserve mining's tailings were being found in the drinking water for several communities that use Lake Superior as their primary, unfiltered water source. The water surrounding reserve in those years was not blue, but green.
Back in the early 50s is when reserve mining started building their plant up there, and they started dumping in October of 55. And by 56, August 27th of 56, that's when the dirty water reached our place and went beyond. And every year it was getting worse and worse, and the herring just disappeared.
In 1968, a Department of Interior task force led by Charles Schnoderd initiated a study of the effects of taconite tailings on Lake Superior. This DOI investigation began the long and divisive role of the federal government in the reserve affair. In early 1969, the Sierra Club and other citizen groups filed suit against the state, attempting to force the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to apply newly authorized water quality standards following the Water Quality Act of 1965. On February 17, 1972, on behalf of the EPA, the Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against the reserve mining company in U.S. District Court. The public, worried about their water and the asbestos deaths around the country, watched closely. The trial was even covered nationwide. The trial lasted over a year, and appeals dragged the case on until 1980. Both the federal government and reserve relied on a prestigious lineup of scientists to buttress their case. In the end, the court found that the health risks presented by the discharges warranted an immediate injunction. A reserve discharge into the water was a violation of the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1948, the first major U.S. law to address water pollution. Growing public awareness and concern for controlling water pollution led to sweeping amendments in 1972. As amended in 1972, the law became commonly known as the Clean Water Act. In addition, reserve violated the Refuse Act, Section 13 of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899, the oldest environmental legislation in the United States. The act makes it a misdemeanor to discharge refuse matter of any kind into the navigable waters or tributaries thereof of the United States without a permit. Reserves discharge into the air created a common law nuisance condition to the ambient air in Silver Bay and the surrounding communities and was subject to abatement. Nuisance is a public or common nuisance when it involves annoyance, injury, or danger to the public in general. A public nuisance may also impinge on the rights of a private person nearby to use and enjoy a property. On top of all that, the air discharge also violated Minnesota air regulations. The lovely William Verity ended up becoming Reagan's Secretary of Commerce in '87. After that interaction, Lord recounts that he was furious. That afternoon, he ordered Reserve to stop dumping its waste into Lake Superior, effective immediately. Some 3,000 people were suddenly out of work. The United States lost 1/12 of its supply of iron ore in one day. The Reserve Mining Company defended the pollution, arguing that it was impossible to dump the tailings on land. However, during the trial, subpoenaed documents found that Reserve had already examined dumping on land as an acceptable alternative. Reserve mining was ordered shut down in 1974, yet less than 48 hours later, the plant was ordered reopened by 3 judges from the 8th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, and they continued to dump with permission until 1980, when they began to deposit their waste in a $375 million inland pond. The same pond the current owner, North Shore Mining, still uses today. The ponds, seen here, are absolutely enormous. Compare them to the plant and town of Silver Bay to the east. Today, there is still significant scientific uncertainty and public concern over the mineral fibers in Minnesota's taconite industry as mining continues.
They had to quit dumping in the lake in '84, and now the herring are starting to show up again. It gets a little better every year. So things are looking up. It's going in the right direction now. And I think now people are more keep in mind the environment and try and keep the air and the water clean. Hopefully we never have nothing like that again.
United States of America v. Reserve Mining Company was a fairly landmark decision, one that gave the EPA broader powers to regulate corporate pollution, a practice that wasn't very common at the time. The fight established a new reality for industry. Since the Reserve case, the government gets to decide how much industry can pollute. Today, everyone accepts the fact that the government sets pollution standards, and it's not incredibly common that industry fights those regulations in court. Even the 8th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals made history in their decision to reopen the mine. Judge Myron Bright set a significant precedent in American environmental law. His legal opinion on Reserve was the first to deal with a major theme in environmental law: how regulatory policies must be made in the face of a scientific uncertainty and a possible economic ramification. In the Reserve case, Judge Bright concluded that policymakers must determine whether the environmental or health risks were significant and then eliminate those risks to the extent feasible. As a result, Bright ruled a potential but unproven risk did exist in taconite tailings.
I think it was precedent setting. It gave all the industry a lot of heads up about what their liability and future liability could be, and that they needed to plan differently. The whole permitting genre came up for both air and water discharges and emissions, and that really was, both of those are game changers.
Reserve Mining had to abate its discharges into the water and air, but it was allowed reasonable time to complete the technological changes in its operations. United States of America v. Reserve Mining Company also led the way for other Great Lake environmental legislation, such as the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement of 1978 and Title I of the Great Lakes Critical Programs Act of 1990, signed by the USA and Canada, where the two nations agreed to reduce certain toxic pollutants in the Great Lakes. The law required the EPA to establish water quality criteria for the Great Lakes, addressing 29 toxic pollutants with maximum levels that are safe for humans, wildlife, and aquatic life. Unfortunately, the legacy of pollution at Reserve was not done yet. In 1999, soil and waste remedial investigatory work found 2 additional areas of contamination: an illegal drum burial pit and a landfill.
Part of the bankruptcy lawsuit, they wanted to keep the jobs, so the state worked with them to keep all the jobs and transfer like the permits over to the new company. And as part of that effort, they had to do an evaluation of any environmental issues on either of their properties, and there was issues on both properties. So there were 5 issues identified in that search. And they knew there was some drums buried on one end of the scrapyard, but that's all they knew.
The drum burial pit contained 2,755-gallon drums of open gear lube containing lead and approximately 1,200 cubic yards of hazardous waste. The landfill, roughly 4.5 acres, contained both hazardous and non-hazardous drums of leaded grease, solid waste, a drum of floor dry, paint waste, 3,500 8 feet in diameter used truck tires, and hazardous chromium.
So then, as part of the agreement, they set aside $2 million to address all 5 of those issues. And then the sale went through. As the state and the company progressed with looking at the scrapyard, we realized that there were a lot more drums than what they said there was. But Reserve was bankrupt, so we couldn't go back after them. So that's how we ended up, kind of taking over, because there wasn't enough money in the escrow. But we determined that there was an unacceptable risk to mostly Lake Superior.
The groundwater and surface water were both impacted by the release of heavy metals into a nearby tributary, which discharged 0.5 miles downstream into Lake Superior.
The landfill was on bedrock. Within a half mile of the lake. It has a spectacular view of the lake from the top of the landfill, I will say that. But it's very close. So it was an unlined dump, basically, that was, 150 feet deep, and they just threw everything in the hole. They ran it over a couple times with their bulldozers, and then would cover it up periodically. So there was nothing preventing that waste from interacting with groundwater.
In 2005, a 2-year massive $13 million cleanup began, headed by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, the largest state-funded Superfund project at the time. Judge Lord was quoted on the additional cleanup, saying, quote, "I'm not surprised Reserve also polluted the land. The legacy of Reserve mining is corruption and poison. The company ignored the environment because it had the economic muscle and political clout to do so." Reserve declared bankruptcy in 1986 and was required 3 years later to establish an escrow account of $2 million to pay for cleanup and reclamation costs. In an effort to reopen the plant, state officials arranged for its future owners to bear no liability for pollution problems that they did not cause. As we know, under CERCLA, this is generally not the case. North Shore Mining, which currently operates the taconite plant, did not need to pay for cleanup costs and was cooperative with the state in allowing access to the property for studies and excavation. Reserve's escrow account dried up quickly, and additional funds to clean up the company's pollution came from the state's Superfund and a special legislative appropriation. In the end, the cleanup dug up 12,507 leaky drums of hazardous waste.
The state ended up doing with the new company was a stipulation agreement that has certain activities that each entity will abide by and actions they'll take. So it was all spelled out in a 1989 stipulation agreement.
Cliffs Mining, who owns Reserve Mining now, brought in $5.3 billion last year. Their CEO makes over $16 million a year. Compare that to Minnesota's median income of roughly $36,000. The drinking water being polluted adversely affected both Duluth and Silver Bay, whose median incomes are $25,000 and $30,000 respectively. Although Reserve operated 40 years ago, this inequity was still present then. As Reserve and Cliffs exploit Minnesota's natural resources, they are polluting the local people and communities who call Lake Superior home. The money they make doesn't go back into those communities. They don't drink the contaminated water. Cliffs Incorporated and their CEO are based in Cleveland, Ohio. This is yet another example of environmental injustice where the perpetrator never sees the consequences of their actions. For additional information on this topic and other mines in Minnesota, I would recommend visiting the Center for Biological Diversity's website. They're a nonprofit and have great information about mines, mineral exploration, and mineral leasing on the Lake Superior watershed, including areas of concern and new mining activity. On the website, you can find current mines and their existing problems, as well as links for outreach and action.